You will be surprised to hear that what I want to speak with you about today is primarily and I'll call it a settlement. I don't think that that's an accurate description of what it is, although it's the language that we're forced to use. I think we're in a kind of Orwellian situation where the terms maybe remain the same, but their meaning is being hollowed out by the deep corruption of the rule of law by Donald Trump's presidential administration and by the collaboration, the corroboration, the collusion probably is the best word of his entire party and of important elements of the judicial system as well. What settlement am I referring to? Let's call it an instrument, maybe. Of course, the 1.8, nearly $2 billion settlement that Donald Trump reached with the Internal Revenue Service and the federal government, Donald Trump, the private individual, suing Donald Trump, the president, in what was clearly a non-adversarial or again collusional pretext of a lawsuit. I believe that it's clear that this idea that was behind it from the very beginning was that this would never go to court, that there would be some sort of agreement between Trump and Trump on the outcomes that he wanted to see. And what he wanted to see was, on the one hand, complete um, lack of scrutiny, complete immunity for himself and his family for both past deeds and future misconduct. We'll get into the details, but the language of the instrument is so vague that I think it really does potentially open the door to the idea that Donald Trump can cite this, his family can cite this instrument, and try to skate away from any kind of allegations of any kind of misconduct, illegality, criminality in the remainder of Donald Trump's life and maybe beyond. But more important, I think, is the fact that this creates, it's being referred to as a slush fund. I think maybe while that term is obviously popular and not particularly flattering, the better way to describe this is as government funded money for Donald Trump's allies to continue to attack, hollow out the key institutions of American democracy, and that this occurs at the precipice of a campaign season in which the American people seem poised to try to punish Donald Trump and his party for deeply unpopular policies, and that the magnitude of the sum, the complete lack of any kind of independent oversight of the way in which the funds will be distributed, the fact that, in essence, the funds can be used in any way Donald Trump and his allies see fit. And then let us note, right, that there's no scrutiny, no transparency, no mechanism for oversight to restrain the use of the funds, that the funds and I think it's $1.77 billion. It's nearly $1.8 billion. Um, have to be spent by December 1st of 2028. And if there's any remnant left, Donald Trump himself gets to determine how they get to be used. This is the stuff of authoritarian regimes. This is the stuff of autocracy. This is using the state's power to bolster one side of the partisan playing field. The state is not neutral. The partisan competition does not occur within the constraints of the rule of law. There is not a capacity of the people of the United States to fairly exercise their judgment as to which party they want to reward in the next election. This is classic Putin. Classic strong-manned autocracy, 21st century illiberal democracy. This is what Project 2025 was all about, and it is being executed nakedly and in, frankly, a legalistically competent way. One of the law scholars who I saw interviewed on this, actually one of the people who was in charge of prosecuting Donald Trump under Jack Smith, referred to this as practiced corruption. Unlike the first Trump administration, where Donald Trump was surrounded by people who continued to believe in the spirit as well as the letter of the law, this is an administration that has surrounded Donald Trump with competent lawyers and partisans and hacks who understand how to use the law to further the undermining of the rule of law. That is what we are witnessing, and the timing is not accidental. It occurs right as the primary season is heating up, and in an effort, it seems to me quite apparently, to encourage lawlessness, intimidation, thuggishness in and around the elections of 2026. In particular, the beneficiaries of the fund will be people who have suffered from, quote, lawfare and the weaponization of the law under and only under the Biden administration. The people who were prosecuted, in other words, for invading the Congress on January 6, 2020. This includes the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. And I think you can be very confident if, for instance, the head of the Proud Boys receives $100 million payout from this fund, and I see no reason to think that it won't be large sums like that, right? This will be kept private. It will not be subject to disclosure or supervision of any kind. What do you think that money will be used for? Do you think he buys a beachfront apartment on Miami Beach? Or do you think the money goes right back into the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, and other right-wing terrorist organizations that will harry, harass, do their very best to prevent the elections of 2026 from going off fairly? And if they do, in fact, end up returning control of Congress to the Democratic Party, they will be used to try to prevent those results from being registered or taking hold. This is the autocrat's playbook being executed in plain sight. We'll talk about this more in a moment, but I'm going to suggest to you that the corruption is the point. Donald Trump has recognized that he cannot prevail in the Democratic metric in 2026. He would, if he were to try to win the 2026 elections, to maintain control of Congress, the Senate, and the House, have to stop punishing his antagonists within the Republican Party. Recognize that some of those people will probably have better prospects for winning elections, and he will have to change course on Iran, where he's talking about perhaps resuming hot war in the coming weeks. He would have to, become a different kind of president. And rather than doing that, Donald Trump has indicated in action and words, when he said, for instance, a couple weeks ago, that he doesn't think one bit about the hardship that his war is creating for the American people, A normal president would try to walk back that statement. That's a gift to the opposition. If there's going to be a free, fair, competitive election in 6 months, Donald Trump stands by that statement, and he stands by it because he's playing a different role at this point in his presidency. He sees himself as a strongman leader, and that's the kind of thing a strongman leader says. Vladimir Putin of Russia is right, a president who is waging a very unpopular war, and his people are suffering economically as well as militarily, tremendous casualties, but deep economic strain, and Putin does not back down, does not apologize, because he is not accountable to the people, as opposed to that what Vladimir Putin does is punish anyone in a position of power who dares show any independence or stand up to him. This is exactly what that man is doing in the United States in 2026. I think we would be foolish not to regard it for what it apparently is, an effort to use all of the power vested in the executive branch as if it were his personal fiefdom in order to secure himself from any kind of democratic political accountability for the unpopularity of his policies, as well as to secure his gains, his ill-got corrupt gains, while president. Now, here's the question. Will it work? Right? And this is where I want to focus the deeper analysis today. And my suggestion to you is that unfortunately, it is an open question. I do not see a clear-cut answer. I'll contrast this very quickly with Richard Nixon. And as we all remember, in the early 1970s, when Richard Nixon was impeached by the House of Representatives in control of the Democratic Party for blatant illegality and criminal conduct, his response initially was to say, well, I will prevail because I will prevail in the Senate, right? Because my party controls the Senate. And Barry Goldwater had to go to the White House and announce to Richard Nixon that his party was not going to back him if he was explicitly corrupt and engaged in criminal conduct, as the tapes eventually revealed that he was, and that therefore he needed to resign, get out of the way, because his party had made an oath to the Constitution of the United States, and they were going to keep that oath. In 2026, we are in an entirely different political landscape. On the one hand, Donald Trump has basically tamed his party to the point where it seems to, for the most part, prioritize fidelity to him over fidelity to law or constitution. And so as long as his party is in control of both houses of Congress, and even if it doesn't cede a super majority to the Democrats, he does not need to worry about impeachment. But I think he's playing a more dangerous game than that. He's assuming that ultimately he may be able to do enough mischief in the next elections that he can win them, not because he actually wins the popular vote or because he has the support of the people, but because his party distorts the political process, both through gerrymandering and then through various efforts to intimidate, disqualify, or in other ways distort the democratic process and the voters within it. So this is, I think, where we are in the late spring of 2026. I am not 100% certain that this is the direction we're going. I'm certainly not certain that it will succeed. But having said that, I think that we have to recognize that we're not in the 1970s. Our institutions and parties are deeply corrupted, deeply unpopular, lacking in legitimacy, lacking in many respects in resolve to defend our system of government. And so the danger is real and deep. let me get into some of the details here. I'll start with the so-called Anti-Weaponization Fund. I'll say just a little bit. I assume we're all up to speed on the news about this, but very quickly, the idea that Donald Trump sued the federal government, the administration, the executive branch that he is the head of, as a private citizen, together with his sons and his family-owned business, for the disclosure of his taxes, which were leaked to the New York Times, eventually reported on by a number of agencies. And he is right that that was wrong, that was illegal. There's a man, Charles Littlejohn, who has pleaded guilty to having done this. By the way, he's not an employee of the Internal Revenue Service. He is a private consultant who was working for the Internal Revenue Service at the time that the documents were leaked by him. The last time this happened, the Internal Revenue Service settled the lawsuit simply by apologizing to the individual whose tax returns were leaked. Now, if this were a regular legal process, it would have gone in front of a judge, and the judge almost certainly would have dismissed the case because, it is a collusional case. It's a case in which the two supposed adversaries are actually the same person, Trump v. Trump, if you will. And if it were not the case that it were dismissed as an improper suit, it certainly would have been the case that $10 billion, the annual operating budget of the Internal Revenue Service, there was no way to demonstrate anything like that amount of damage. This whole thing was cooked up, and it is brazenly corrupt. The point is to do the corruption in plain sight, to point out, to try to, I'm sorry, didn't mean to advance the slides, to try to basically make true indeed what you falsely assert in words, which is that the Department of Justice, the Internal Revenue Service are already corrupt and weaponized, agencies of the federal government, that Joe Biden, when bringing these cases against the people who invaded the Capitol on January 6, 2020, who were attacking the very heart of democracy, the very heart of the process via which we peacefully transfer power from administration to administration. They were, by the way, the first of them already charged under Donald Trump's Department of Justice, not under Joe Biden's Department of Justice. And I'll stop speaking that way. The Department of Justice, where the president gets to appoint the attorney general, but then under the norms and rules and expectations, the values that govern that department, well, the attorney general is independent and not the personal lawyer of the president of the United States. Many of the defendants in those cases pled guilty, and not only did they plead guilty, they apologized for their conduct. They indicated that they had been misled, lied to, deceived by the president, Donald Trump, into invading Congress because they really thought the election had been stolen. Once he was out of power and discredited, they recognized that what they had done was wrong and criminal, and they pled guilty. That's not weaponization. What is happening now is weaponization, And so the idea that Donald Trump is brazenly, explicitly saying it's my Department of Justice and it's going to do what I want it to do is not just, a effort to use bad law, We'll get into the federal settlement law of 1956 in a few minutes, to suit his purposes. It is also a effort to fundamentally corrupt the Department of Justice, to rewrite history. This is where things get Orwellian, to basically say that what had been the impartial administration of justice was weaponization. What is weaponization is the impartial administration of justice. So Trump is now in a position, his acting Attorney General Todd Blanche and 5 people to be appointed by him, 4 people to be appointed by him plus him, and Donald Trump, can at will fire and replace any of these individuals if he doesn't like what they're doing, are now going to distribute nearly $2 billion. And let us be clear about this, right? That this is in part an effort to rewrite history, to say that the FBI's search of Mar-a-Lago for documents that should not have been there, that the people who invaded Congress on January 6th, that they were not, justified actions, the prosecution of them. I'm sorry, the idea that instead, history can now be rewritten. January 6th was appropriate. The election had been stolen. Mar-a-Lago was lawfare, because it was Joe Biden's effort to discredit Donald Trump. This is deep, explicit, and practiced corruption of the worst kind. Let's get into the details just for a moment. The source of the money is what's called the Judgment Fund, which Congress established in 1956, modified a couple times since then to allow it to pay out not only lawsuits but settlements, no longer capping the amount that can be paid, but creating essentially a limitless fund, and so this is legal, this is bad law, and this is one of those places where I think we should acknowledge that the spirit and not just the letter of the law matters deeply. Congress set this up trying to address a problem. It doesn't need to legislate every time there's a settlement in order to pay it out, but it assumed that it would be used in good faith. This is clearly not the case. The commission, and so let me say this very quickly, lawyers are trained in law school to always scrutinize the deciders, who gets to make the decision. And under the terms of this instrument, the acting Attorney General Todd Blanche appoints a 5-member commission, of which he is one, and the commission has unilateral power to evaluate and approve payouts. There's no judicial or congressional or independent oversight whatsoever. Then note, claimant anonymity. Claimants whose legal battles or purported damages are compensated remain anonymous to the general public, as do the exact amounts they receive, Again, kind of just a blanket of corruption covers this document. And then please note that for Donald Trump, the instrument includes a sweeping codicil, and I'll say this very quickly. This was signed by Todd Blanche. The rest of this signed by the IRS, and this is where the level of legal expertise is clear, because basically under statutes passed in the aftermath of Watergate and Nixon's instrumentalization of the Internal Revenue Service, there is law that prevents the Internal Revenue Service from doing anything at the behest of the president unless the Attorney General is the person who orders it, Again, the assumption being that the Attorney General will act on the basis of the rule of law. So Todd Blanche signs the side agreement announced a day after the payout fund is announced, and that states that the federal government is, quote, forever barred and precluded from pursuing claims against Mr. Trump involving, quote, lawfare and or weaponization. It's also precluded from auditing Donald Trump, his businesses, or related affiliates for past tax returns up until May 19th, 2026, right? Now, let me notice one thing about this, right? The terms lawfare and weaponization of the law are not legal terms. They're made up terms, part of the post-truth rhetoric of this president. And what matters here is, on the one hand, that this commission then gets to say what is and isn't weaponization without scrutiny, without oversight, and using a category that has no definition or no clear-cut legal meaning, right? In other words, it gets to give money to whom, more or less whomever it wants to. And that the same thing is true with Donald Trump. If he is, right, let us say, using the power of the presidency to enrich himself, and it is later, right, the case that he leaves office, this is not about, right, something related to the core functions of the presidency, for which he already has immunity thanks to the Supreme Court's decision in the People versus Donald Trump. As opposed to that, this is clear, naked, personal corruption. He still can maintain that this is just lawfare or weaponization, and that he has an agreement with the federal government that he cannot be prosecuted, right? That's how sweeping this thing is. And then let me say one last thing. What is the point of doing this? Well, on the one hand, the point is clearly to reward his friends and to provide them with the resources to continue to try to attack the democratic process of the United States, as they did in the original cause, right? The invasion of Congress on January 6th. But I think the deeper expressive purpose of this document is to encourage like-minded people to do it again, to make it clear, right? The first day that Donald Trump was in the presidency in his second term, he signed an executive order giving, right, immunity to everyone who had invaded the Capitol. He used the pardon power, the power of clemency, to commute or overturn the sentences of everyone, right? And please recognize that within the Republican Party, on that day in January, the pardoning or clemency for the people who had violently assaulted federal police officers, who had caused brain damage, who had crushed them indoors, who'd attacked them with flagpoles, who'd turned their own shields against them, who'd sprayed them with bear spray, and in order to invade the Congress, in order to go after Nancy Pelosi and Vice President Pence, and ultimately to prevent Congress from doing its constitutional business in terms of registering the results of the 2020 election. Those heroes, right, who stood in the way of a rampaging crowd who had been incited by the president, it was not very popular within the Republican Party in 2025. A little bit more than a year, not even a year and a half ago, to pardon them. Now, they're not just being pardoned, they're not just skating away from their legal misconduct, from their criminal behavior in many cases, from their violent attack on American democracy and American law enforcement officers. They are now being financially rewarded for doing that. And right, there's a particular case of an individual who's engaged in sexual harassment and who appears to be expecting a payout to be able to pay out his victims. That's the grotesque part of this, right? Just hard to imagine that we live in this kind of society. But the more mundane, but also, I think, ultimately dangerous aspect of this is what it says, what it expresses, what it conveys, which is that as long as you do things that are in the president's interest, no matter how vile, criminal, or violent they are, not only will you not pay serious legal consequences, you will in fact be rewarded not by the man, the President of the United States, but by his government. This is the worst kind of corruption. It is obviously incompatible with the rule of law or the system of government that we like to call a democracy. And my claim here is that the corruption is the point. That, as I have said to you before, right, the way in which you sustain the core bedrock principle on which the system of government that we aspire to have rests, the principle of the rule of law, that we are a country of laws and not of men, that if you violate the law, no matter which side you are on, you will be held to account, that we can therefore have the security that the rule of law provides, that as long as I conduct myself in accord with the law, I will not be targeted for violence by the state. And alternatively, those who break the law, no matter how powerful they are, no matter whose friends they are, no matter which side they are on politically speaking, they will be held to account. This is an effort to undermine that and to say to the American people, you have a different kind of president, a different kind of administration. You need to recognize, you need to be careful. This is designed to chill opposition to Donald Trump and to reward support for him, no matter how bad his policies are for the people of the United States. This possibility, I'm sorry to say, was lurking in plain sight, and we now get to the problem, right? Which is to say that to maintain the rule of law requires not just laws on the book, but people in the Justice Department, in the various prosecutorial offices, the judges and the lawyers and the partisan officials throughout the United States. Alexis de Tocqueville, who I like returning to very often when thinking about this, said that the United States had a particular esprit de corps, as he called it in French, on the part of his lawyers who seemed to have an almost religious commitment to the Constitution and to the rule of law, and the fact that in the United States, most of the politicians, as well as almost all of the judges, were drawn from lawyers who had that spirit, provided a bulwark for the strength of American democracy. This is directly an attack on this. So I want to read you a couple different quotes. The first from a law professor, Samuel Bagantos at the University of Michigan, who warned us just months ago about the possibility that this fund would be corrupted by this administration. He says, quote, an administration that wished to spend money on projects or beneficiaries not authorized by Congress could simply encourage its desired recipient to bring a lawsuit against the United States and then settle that lawsuit, no matter how frivolous, by making payments from the judgment fund, right? So this is the problem when the Attorney General, the people surrounding the president, are loyal to the president and not to the rule of law that assumes that it will be administered in a spirit of impartiality can be used badly by those who have bad intentions. This is the federal district court judge, Judge Janice Rogers Brown, dissenting in a case in which this law was challenged. She says, perhaps one day I will possess my colleague's schadenfreude toward the executive branch raiding hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars out of the Treasury, in this case, billions, putting them into a slush fund disguised as a settlement and doling the money out to whatever constituency the executive wants bankrolled, right? This is what is happening in 2026. Janice Rogers Brown was talking about another case. But let me pivot from that to the context in which this occurs. And I start with it being Memorial Day weekend and the price of gas, right? Donald Trump launched a war in Iran now more than 2.5 months ago, coming up on 3 months as we get to the end of May. And it is worthwhile noting, right, that the war has not accomplished any of its main aims, but that the American people are paying the cost. We have an inflation rate going up, right, rapidly, particularly with regards to gas prices, but because gas is related to how we convey everything in our complex economy, the price of everything else is going up as well. Consumers are unhappy, right? This is the consumer sentiment track, right? University of Michigan constructs this index, and it is at, as of right a couple days ago, the May readout, the lowest point in the history of the index, which goes back roughly 75 years, lower than the COVID low point, lower than the Great Recession of 2008 low point. People are not just unhappy, people are despairing of this economy and their ability to afford the necessities of life, the essential goods and services like healthcare, like gasoline, like rent or mortgage, like education. And so Donald Trump, right, is suffering, right? He is the most unpopular history in the history. I'm sorry, the most unpopular president in the history of modern polling. And, this is a secular trend. It shows no sign of abating. Just a couple days ago, it was below 20%. It just depends on which poll comes out when, what the average is. So one way to think about this is that in these circumstances, the President of the United States, if he were interested in not producing a bloodbath for his party in the midterm elections, which usually do not favor the incumbent party, would be pivoting, would be softening, would be making conciliations to try to assist his party in resisting the partisan tide of public opinion. He is not doing that, right? He said, and I think in this incredibly telling way, that he does not think at all about the economic pain that his war is causing the American people. He continues to go on this vindictive campaign of punishing anyone in his party who has dared to show an iota of independence from him, let alone to actually thwart him. And so we see him now endorsing Ken Paxton in Texas. And by the way, he remains popular enough with the base of his party, I'll get into this in a few minutes, that he is able to successfully punish those who resist him in the primaries. But as we saw in 2022 when Donald Trump endorsed a large number of election deniers, and they mainly lost, especially in the Senate campaigns, the fact that Donald Trump can push his preferred candidate across the finish line in a primary does not translate to the general election, especially if he is this unpopular. So what is Donald Trump doing? What is the game in 2026? And I want to suggest that it appears that he is no longer interested in what I would call democratic metrics, right? The idea that he is doing things to win the next election or to secure support for his party seems obviously not to be the case. As opposed to that, he appears to be more interested in what I'll call the authoritarian metric, the metric that says, I am strong enough that I don't have to care about the will of the people. I think people who are sane washing Donald Trump, who are trying to say this makes sense, are saying, well, he cares more about history now that he's in his second term. I have an entirely different interpretation. He cares more about the metric of naked partisan power and the use of the state to continue to augment that power. That is why he is behaving the way he's behaving. That is the best cautionary lens through which to view what he's doing, and especially to view the danger of possessing a nearly $2 billion slush fund. I will add that at the same time, right, his party is engaged in rampant gerrymandering and doing so, of course, in violation of democratic norms. This is supposed to occur only at the decade point after we have a census. We're in the middle of the decade. Why are they doing it? Because they're trying to prevent the American people from translating their disapproval of the president into electoral change, right? And so again, this is about the use of authority and power, and it appears that at the present moment, whether it's 3 or 13 new seats, right, that the Republicans get to control as a result of gerrymandering will depend on how deeply unpopular the president is and how much that translates into a blue wave or a blue tidal wave kind of election. It could be that the Democrats will, in fact, succeed despite the gerrymandering, despite the unfair, unprincipled, change the rules in the middle of the game approach to politics. But just let us notice for a second, this will certainly reduce drastically the representation of African Americans and maybe other racial minorities in Congress. It is, in that sense, a deep step backwards in terms of racial justice, in terms of our society's capacity to put into Congress people who actually look like the people of the United States. But it is also an effort to prevent democracy from functioning, to use whatever instruments are available to nakedly purchase whatever partisan advantage can be purchased. I then add, right, that this administration is excelling in terms of its use of the authoritarian playbook. It has the benefit of having witnessed what Erdogan did in Turkey, what Putin did in Russia, what Orban did in Hungary, and it is on basic objective measurements constructed by political scientists, doing this more rapidly than any of them did it, right? They are using the power of control over all three branches of the federal government to try to consolidate control in such a way that the people of the United States will not be able to use electoral power to regain control. And by the way, they do so at a moment when the people of the United States have eroding faith in the system of government of the United States, eroding in part because of the deep disparities in income and wealth, the obvious unfairness, the downward mobility of the majority of the American people, and the complete incapacity of the government of the United States, which is supposedly democratic, to do anything about the growing precariousness of the majority of the people of the United States. What good is it to live in a democracy if the democracy does not secure the basic goods, the standing, or the security of the people of the United States. Right. And so Donald Trump is attacking democracy at a moment when democracy is already weakened. Again, just another metric of inequality, but then please note that there are other things that have many people in the United States upset or morally panicked, right? The way in which women seem to be outpacing men in college education and graduate school, the move away from organized religion, the attack on, I shouldn't say attack, that's the wrong word, the erosion of support for traditional gender roles, especially among younger adults in the United States. All of this is, right, distressing to the core Trump voter. Um, and let me say this very quickly. There's a problem, right, with the Democratic Party too. I'll get to this in just a moment. Let me see what my next slide is. Yeah, I've got the evidence here, right, which is to say that actually the Democratic Party, right, and this is as of April 2026, so quite recent, at a point when Donald Trump is deeply unpopular, the Democratic Party is actually more unpopular, less favorably viewed than the Republican Party. And in many states in the United States, the Democratic Party is so toxic, right? Its brand is so associated with moving in the wrong direction, right? With increased inequality, with globalization, which has produced the inequality, the idea that Clinton and Obama were globalists, were multiculturalists who ceded advantage to racial minorities and who therefore undercut the standing of the white working class, who favor women and the unreligious and the queer over ordinary Americans. This is dragging down the Democratic Party brand. And so we're entering an election in which the president of the United States is deeply unpopular, but perhaps the opposition party is not able to take advantage of that or to mount a principled campaign against the corruption and the deep threat to the rule of law in our democracy because their brand is so tainted. Uh, Let me then say a little bit more. I think the reason Donald Trump, despite all of his problems, and here I come back from a conference in Europe, as you know, where I was last week, and I heard a number of papers about right-wing populism, not just in the United States, but in Europe, and they helped me to consolidate my views about this, that what the right-wing populists do, what Donald Trump is able to do, is two things that the Democrats or the traditional left parties have been unable to do successfully in the 21st century. The first is to give legitimacy and recognition to the perspective, the experience, the feeling structure of many voters, that our countries are moving in the wrong direction and that the political elite have been insensitive to this, that they don't care because, frankly, they are not the people who are being damaged by the movement in this direction. They're the beneficiaries of globalization, or they're on the payrolls of the people who are the beneficiaries. And the anger that this gives rise to, the resentment, the deep vein of just livid outrage at the fact that our country no longer works for us. The true majority, the true people, the long-term residents of this country are no longer served by their political system. Donald Trump continues to be successful at expressing, at mobilizing, at stirring up that kind of anger. And the Democratic Party does not do so nearly so well, right? And then we add, by the way, that Donald Trump, the right-wing populists, give us someone to blame, someone to target. It's the immigrants. It's the globalists. It's the multicultural effete elite. And it's the irreligious, deeply corrupt institutions of our society. And so when Donald Trump corrupts the Justice Department and says it's always been corrupt, but now at least it's working for me and for you, right? There's a sense in which this resonates with an important sphere of American society. When the Democrats say this is corruption, this is an attack on the rule of law, this is an effort to undermine the system on which our government and our democracy rests, many Americans say, well, I'm not sure that system works for me anymore. So why should I stand up for it? Why should I vote for you when all you can claim is that you will support and defend an institutional system that has not worked for me for half a century? Right? And so when we look at this, right, many Americans think our political system is too divided, that polarization, the Republicans, the state of democracy, and the Democrats are the most important problem facing our country today. And all the Democrats can say is, watch out for that guy, he's attacking our system. Well, what if enough Americans don't care about that system, don't have faith in it, don't think it works anymore? And by the way, again, for good reasons, because it does not respond to most Americans' preferences. It does instead objectively respond to the economic elite's preferences. And we have a sense of this. We may not have the fancy multivariate regressions that political scientists run to demonstrate this, to quantify this, to make this case impartially, but we're aware, right, that when interest groups favor a policy, that policy gets passed. When the top 10% or 1% favor a policy, that policy gets passed. When average citizens favor a policy, it makes no difference. Our political system has so many veto points that it makes making a decision incredibly difficult, blocking a decision on the part of lobbyists or those who have great resources very easy, right? And so the idea that to bring this home, right, that we have two parties and that they represent different groups of Americans. We've talked about this together before, that the right Republican Party has become a vehicle for expressing anti-institutional rage, as well as white resentment against Blacks, against Hispanics, against Muslims, against gays, this widespread sense of the erosion of status on the part of the white working class has found its vehicle in Donald Trump. The Democratic Party, right, has become a diverse, multiracial party, and it is therefore associated with the trends that many voters think are deeply disturbing trends in the direction of immigration, globalization, multiculturalism. This is driving a trend around the world away from democracy and in the direction of autocracy. I believe what we've just witnessed from the Trump administration in the last week in this settlement fund is a clear indication that this administration is not, right, pumping the brakes. They're not saying we've gone too far, we've done enough, there's an election coming up, we better slow down, we better be a little bit more conciliatory so that we don't get punished at the polls. They are saying full steam ahead. I didn't really talk about this with you today. I'm seeing that I'm nearly out of time, but let me just spend a moment on this, because I think in addition to the gerrymandering, in addition to the weaponization front, in addition to the way in which, right, the people of the United States increasingly do not have faith in democracy and so may not be willing to vote for the Democrats if they stand up for the rule of law, we have the fact that the administration is laying the groundwork for using federal power against Democrats, against their opponents. They're using, right, National Security Presidential Memorandum number 7 to define anybody who is anti-American, anti-capitalist, anti-Christian as a terrorist, right? Anybody who shows hostility towards traditional American views on family, religion, and morality should be investigated by the FBI, the Department of Justice, and the Internal Revenue Service. This is, again, the authoritarian playbook being exercised in plain daylight by an American president. Remember what happened in Minneapolis, right? Where we have the Department of Homeland Security saying that they do not need warrants to arrest people, that we have a remarkable increase in warrantless arrests, that we have the administration asserting absolute immunity for the Department of Homeland Security officers. We have direct contempt for lower court holdings again and again and again in this administration, right? And what this all conveys, right? When your government lies to you, when it uses Orwellian rhetoric, when it falsifies images, that there's no independent truth of the matter to appeal to and holding the government accountable. And then we have, as I've mentioned to you before, these presidential emergency action declarations, which are by law secret, right? You can actually be charged with treason for disclosing their terms. We don't know what they are. There appears to be some, right, grumbling from within the administration that the administration is preparing them. Again, I just think I may be Chicken Little. I may be saying the sky is falling when in fact it's not. But I think we need to be prepared for the scenario in which, if the election of 2026 is not going Donald Trump's way, he will use every instrument of power available to him, and they are considerable, to prevent the Democrats from regaining control of Congress. And if he does that, we need to watch out, because then we have 2 more years of unchecked power coming out of the executive branch in a way that I have to say I worry is a deep threat to the rule of law and American democracy. Let me stop on that happy note and open it up for your questions and laments. Who wants to start out first? Flossie, go ahead, and I think you're unmuted, so start us out.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
I am worried about the direction in which somebody like Nancy Pelosi is moving. She was once a powerful woman and still is, but she's working not with, I'm, there may be something with a friendship with a friend of hers who is a gentleman. They have now parted company, and she has appointed as the woman that she wants to work with, a Chinese lady. There are indications more and more that we're moving in the direction of working with a powerful Chinese leader. Put aside Trump for a moment. He's got himself landed in China, and telling the Chinese president that he approves of what the Chinese president is doing, as if the Chinese president cares 2 cents for what Trump believes about his administration. But it's a movement away from what the American people want. We're heading in a kind of global universe that I think you point out doesn't make sense to a lot of people who want to be all inclusive. We tried so hard to include everybody, every racial group. And what we're doing is just pushing a lot of our young people out of their minds. They don't know which direction to go. They're thinking of trying to get to Canada again, Nova Scotia, even Iran if it helps. So there is a disunity, and we need some kind of genius to bring us together, and maybe the power of laughter can do it, but we need a hell of a good satirist.
Yeah.
I throw in my cards. Thank you.
Well, and of course, this week we lost one of our best political satirists, at least from his primetime slot, right? And so, again, I think I'm talking about Stephen Colbert, of course, and the idea that while I like the way he went out with joy and not with bitterness, the idea that this is another victory for this kind of politics, for the politics of small, petty, but consequential vindictiveness, right? And I'm confident Stephen Colbert will be fine. He'll go on to making Lord of the Rings movies, etc., having, a plenty good life. But ordinary people who think about standing up to this president have to look at somebody like Stephen Colbert being fired by his network despite having the #1 rated TV show because he's effective at directing satirical attention at this president. And this president has no sense of humor and an incredibly thin skin and demands complete obsequience, right? And so, yes, this is a sad moment, and let me just pivot for a second. I think we need not only satire, but we need leadership. And we need not only leadership, but we need bottom up organization. And I don't know. I mean, one of the things I've tried to say to you today is that there's this deep reservoir of anger in the American populace right now, that Donald Trump is effective at articulating, at tapping, at stirring up, and then directing to his benefit. We need leaders on the left who are successful at doing something similar. And so we've got maybe Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and a few others, but we need people who say the direction that this country is headed in is the wrong direction. The people who are responsible for undermining the well-being, the standing, the economic security of the majority of Americans do deserve our anger. The alchemy that Donald Trump performs in converting anxiety into anger is valuable to the people who he does it for. But having said that, it's not an actual solution. We need left wing leadership that is populist, that is angry, but that is also capable of identifying solutions to our problems. I'll say this very quickly. It seems to me one of the problems is that many of the difficulties we face are global difficulties, and that much of the way in which we try to solve them at the national level is intrinsically incomplete. We're just not operating at a global level, and so we can't solve global problems nationally. And so the Democrats and the other left-wing, mainstream, democratic parties of the world are going to have to figure out not only how to better secure the interests of the people they represent, but they're also going to have to figure out how to band together to address climate change, to address inequality, to regulate artificial intelligence. And these are difficult problems in the best of times. These are really challenging times in which to do this. So, Flossie, yes, I think we need satire, but we also need leadership. We also need organization. We also need cooperation at a global scale. It's a daunting task, but if we are going to be motivated to rise to the challenge, maybe
Well,
the
you know about what you
depth of
said the law
one
school is doing with artificial intelligence, it will blow your mind. The
okay,
kind
one second, Flossie. I'm just going to finish the point. And so the idea that the depth of the corruption of Donald Trump that's on such clear display this week might just be the kind of motivation we need, right? Sometimes things have to get really bad for people to get aroused and to come into action. That's the only hopeful thing I've got for you today, is it might just be too much. All right. I'm sorry, Flossie. If you want to resume, go ahead, but you'd have to unmute yourself. Also, we should make time and space for other people as well. Anybody else with another comment or question? Flossie, I can't hear you. You're back on being muted. Flossie, I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Anybody else for today? Okay. Well, I'll give Flossie another 10 seconds. You'd have to hold the space bar down, Flossie, or hit that microphone icon for me. There you go. You got it. Yep.
yeah,
There you
I'm
go.
on your side.
I heard I'm on your side, which I appreciated, Flossie, but then I lost you. One more time.
I have to put the satire aside and get to the side that says we ain't laughing now. We have to do something that is strong and get the vote out. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Flossie. Let me, go ahead.
Does Cory Booker have potential as a leader?
I love Cory Booker. Um, but so far he hasn't, right? I think he's been a presidential candidate twice now. He hasn't ever seemed to break um, out, and so maybe this will be his time. And certainly the long filibuster he gave, right? I think it's been a year now, drew attention to him and showed the kind of outrage, anger, spirit that we need at the moment. I think one of the things that's so awful about the 2024 presidential race is that we were denied a primary in which the Democrats got to select the next leader, and that it's possible that Cory Booker, or I mean, and here, who are we to pre-select, right, the person, right? It's got to be up to the people of the United States. And sometimes we actually do have collective wisdom in who we identify. Who would have guessed in 2007 that Barack Obama would have been the standard bearer for the party? So Cory Booker, yes. And then I'll just say the obvious, right? The racial politics of the United States in 2028 will be different from the racial politics of the United States in 2008, and not for the better, unfortunately. And so I think the Democrats really do need to win the next election, and a certain level of pragmatism. I'm not saying that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is better than Cory Booker or vice versa, but that they both, right, are playing to maybe the base of the party, and that we may need a politician who doesn't just play to the base. Let me follow up on a little story I want to share with you. So I was in Europe last week, right? And I went through 3 countries in 10 days. I saw Prague and Brussels and Bruges and Paris and had a fabulous, if exhausting, vacation. But I want to talk with you specifically about the train ride from Prague to Brussels, which was an overnight train ride on a sleeper car. And with these European trains, you don't just get the car to yourself, you share it with people, right? And so the people that my partner and I, Sophia and I, shared the train car with from Prague to Brussels was a couple on vacation. The man was 84, the woman was 81. And if you're familiar with a sleeper car, right, the beds are stacked on top of each other. This 84-year-old man, I was assigned the middle bunk. Sophia was assigned the bottom bunk. I said, "Do you want to trade?" Right? I don't. And he's, "No, I got it." And you climb into this little sheet sleeping bag up on the third right bunk. Uh, and so back to maybe what Flossie is saying, we need to get organized. We need to get out the vote. I often say, well, let's let the younger people, take the mantle at this point. Maybe there's a lesson in that little story for all of us about what we can do, the obstacles of age notwithstanding. I hope that's a happy note to leave it on. I see some of you at least smiling. It's nice to be back with you. I hope you have good weeks. Enjoy the Memorial Day weekend, and I will see you all next week. Thank you, everybody. Be well.
Thank you, David.
Pleasure as always, Jonathan. Thank you. Bye-bye, guys.